Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
When I asked my father to help me with law school tuition, I wasn't looking for a handout or expecting applause. I had worked through every semester of undergrad, waiting tables in the evening, studying during my breaks, and scraping together enough to graduate without drowning in debt. And all I needed now was a nudge, a bit of support to cross the finish line I'd been crawling toward for nearly a decade. I rehearsed my words before I called him. Even though he wasn't the kind of man who needed to be handled gently, he was a retired Army sergeant who treated life like a checklist and expected everyone else to fall in line, especially his kids. But I thought maybe, just maybe, if I showed him the plan, the numbers, the determination, he'd finally see that I wasn't chasing dreams, but building a future. He picked up after the third ring, his voice already impatient, like he knew I wasn't calling just to say hi, and after I'd made my pitch, after I'd laid it all out for him, how I'd been accepted to two strong regional law schools, how I'd saved up part of the tuition, how I'd work part-time and just needed a loan or even a cosigner, he let out this small laugh, the kind that doesn't belong in a conversation about someone's future, the kind that tells you you've already lost before you even asked. "We're not throwing money at another useless degree," he said flatly, and I could practically see him leaning back in his recliner, cracking open a beer, already moving on to whatever was on the TV behind him. "You already went to college, Rachel. Time to grow up. Get a real job. Enough with the books and the dreaming." I didn't say anything at first, because something about the way he said it, it wasn't just dismissive, it was personal, like he wasn't just talking about a law degree, but about me, about who I was and what I was worth. And I remember staring at the wall above my desk, the acceptance letter from Western State pinned right next to an old photo of us from when I was a kid, both of us smiling at the zoo, my small hand wrapped around his pinky finger like it was a lifeline. "You gave Derek the down payment for his truck," I said, not angrily, not even accusing, just as a fact, because maybe he forgot that he'd floated my brother through 3 failed business attempts, 2 DUI settlements, and a car dealership job he left after 6 weeks because the manager had bad energy. "That was different," he said, and then he mumbled something about potential and not throwing good money after bad, and that's when I really knew, that he'd never seen me the way he saw Derek. To him, I was the reliable one, the boring one, the one who didn't need anything, the one who just worked and studied and never asked for more. And maybe I made that too easy for him, maybe I wore the quiet and the confidence too well, but in that moment, I felt like I had been carrying my father's disappointment on my back my whole life, and I didn't even know it. I ended the call before he could keep talking, before I said something I couldn't take back. I sat in silence for a long time. Then I opened my laptop. I didn't post anything, didn't say a word, just scrolled. And there it was. A new photo on his Facebook page, my dad standing next to Derek on a dock somewhere sunny, both of them grinning, one of those expensive fishing boats behind them, the kind that looks like it costs more than a house. The caption read, "Our pride." Not his pride. Our pride. As if Derek belonged to both of them, father and son, champions of the family name, while I was what, a tax deduction and a college graduate who didn't smile enough in family pictures? I remember staring at that post for a long time. Not because I was shocked, but because I realized something in me had shifted. Not snapped, no. Snapping implies drama, noise, chaos. This was quieter. This was like a door closing slowly, finally, after years of creaking open just enough to let in a draft. I didn't comment. I didn't like it. I didn't even cry. I just logged out of Facebook, opened my banking app, accepted the federal loans I had been avoiding, and started working on my scholarship appeals. And then I did something I didn't plan. I deleted the family group chat. No warning. No message. Just gone. I blocked my father's number, archived my childhood photos, and erased the contact saved under Dad from my phone. I figured if he ever called, I'd let it go to voicemail. For the next few weeks, I buried myself in paperwork, packed my things, and moved into a studio apartment near campus with a leaky faucet, paper-thin walls, and just enough space for a mattress and a foldable desk. I worked at the courthouse downtown during the day, barely paid, mostly clerical, but I paid attention. I listened. I watched how the lawyers walked into a room like they belonged there, how judges didn't raise their voices, but somehow everyone still shut up when they spoke. That became my North Star. And here's the thing I didn't expect: once I cut him off, really cut him off, the silence felt good. It felt like stepping out of a room where someone's been talking over you for years. I didn't miss the check-ins. I didn't miss the fake concern. I didn't even miss the holidays. Because something about that rejection, that final, humiliating no, turned into fuel. Some people get burned by betrayal. I burned brighter. Looking back, I think he thought I'd come back around eventually, like I always did, like I'd apologize for pushing too hard or wanting too much. But this time, I didn't. I didn't come home for Thanksgiving. I didn't send a card for his birthday. I watched from a distance as Derek kept living like the world owed him another round, and I just kept grinding. They had no idea where I went. They didn't bother to find out. I didn't give them a reason. I gave them silence. And silence, I've learned, is where revenge is born. Not the loud, movie-style kind. The kind that grows slowly. That waits. And I was willing to wait. There's a strange kind of peace that comes when you decide you don't owe anyone anything anymore, when you finally untangle yourself from the guilt, the hope, and the twisted belief that if you just try hard enough, someone who has never seen you will finally look up and recognize the weight you've carried alone for so long. That peace, for me, began the moment I stepped into my new apartment, a shoebox with yellowed blinds, water stains on the ceiling, and a heater that sounded like it was dying every time it kicked on, but for the first time in years. It felt like the space belonged to me and only me. No more explaining where the money went. No more pretending I wasn't angry. No more waiting for someone to call who never would. I worked mornings at the courthouse under a woman named Yvette, who'd been doing administrative work since the 90s and didn't have patience for people who didn't take their jobs seriously. She had a voice that could cut through cement walls and a drawer full of peppermint candies she doled out like ammunition when the day got too long. She didn't ask too many questions about my past, which I appreciated, but she paid attention, and I could tell she'd figured out I wasn't there to make copies and disappear quietly. I watched the attorneys who breezed in wearing $1,000 shoes and $400 haircuts, speaking in that polished, casual tone people use when they know they belong somewhere. At first, I felt like an outsider peeking through a keyhole. But I kept watching. I took notes on everything: their cadence, their posture, the way they addressed the judge versus how they spoke to the clerks, and slowly, I started to see the seams in the fabric. Law school was brutal in a way I can't even begin to describe, not because of the workload or the reading, but because it demanded a level of self-belief I didn't have yet. I was surrounded by classmates who had parents paying their rent, sending them care packages, wiring them just because money whenever they felt stressed. They took weekend trips to ski lodges and posted photos of charcuterie boards while I reheated canned soup and sold my old textbooks online just to cover my utility bills. I didn't tell anyone about my family. When people asked, I just said I was close with my mother's side, which wasn't a lie, just an omission. I told myself I didn't care that no one called me over break, that no one asked how school was going, that my own father had probably forgotten what semester I was in. But every now and then, I'd find myself scrolling through Derek's latest social media posts just to remind myself how far I was from whatever life they still thought was normal. He posted pictures constantly: new sunglasses, some girl draped over his shoulder in Cabo, a video of him making steak on the boat with the caption, "Built not bought," which was laughable considering that boat had come from the same man who couldn't throw money at his daughter's education because it wasn't worth it. There was one picture that stopped me cold. It was a family barbecue, probably in the backyard of the house I grew up in, the string lights still hanging from the same rusty poles, the grill probably still creaking open the same way it did when I was in high school. My father was there, laughing, a beer in his hand, and Derek had his arm around him like they were brothers instead of father and son. And right in the middle of the photo was a sign Derek had clearly made on some app or Canva or whatever: Heart Family Legacy. I didn't know what made me angrier, the idea that they'd thrown that phrase around like it meant something, or the fact that I was no longer even considered a part of it. Like they'd rewritten the script, cut me from the cast, and kept performing the show without a single missing beat. It would have been easier, maybe, if they'd called and yelled at me for disappearing, accused me of being selfish or dramatic. But they didn't even notice I was gone. That was what burned most. I tried to push it down, to let it roll off me, to focus on my exams and my outlines and keeping my job at the courthouse, but the truth was, it followed me everywhere. Every time I saw a father hugging his daughter outside the courtroom, every time I heard someone mention getting help from home, every time a professor referenced networking through your family, I had to swallow the lump in my throat and act like it didn't apply to me. Because it didn't. And maybe that was the point. I worked my way up at the courthouse, slowly gaining more responsibilities. Yvette took me under her wing in the way only women who have seen too much and survived anyway know how to do, and she started handing me case files to organize, letting me shadow attorneys when they came in to prep. She said I had a mind like a knife, sharp, clean, dangerous if left alone too long. I liked that. I liked that someone finally saw the weight of what I carried and didn't flinch. Law school blurred into a cycle of work, study, sleep, and repeat. There were weeks I barely spoke to anyone outside of class. My grades climbed. My focus sharpened. I got better at hiding the ache behind my eyes. And somewhere along the way, the ache changed shape. It stopped being about needing him to see me. It became about making damn sure that when he did, he wouldn't recognize what he'd thrown away. One evening, as I locked up the records room, Yvette handed me a slip of paper with a scrawled note, "You're tougher than they'll ever give you credit for. Don't forget that." I kept it in my wallet like a relic. Not because I needed the validation, but because it reminded me that not all value is visible. Some of it hides under layers of silence and grit, waiting to be revealed at exactly the right moment. The drift between me and my family wasn't sudden, it was slow, inevitable, like watching a shoreline disappear as your boat pushes further and further out to sea. And at some point, I stopped checking the horizon. I stopped waiting for a lighthouse. I stopped hoping for a call. I just kept rowing. Because I knew where I was going. And I knew one day, without warning, they'd see me standing in a place they never imagined I'd reach. But by then, it would be too late to claim me. There's a very specific kind of freedom that comes when you finally decide you're going to make something of yourself, not to prove a point to anyone else, not to rub it in anyone's face or wave it like a flag in front of the people who doubted you, but simply because you know deep in your bones that if you don't do it, if you don't claw your way up and out of the life that was handed to you like a sentence instead of a beginning, then no one else is going to do it for you, and you'll stay buried under the weight of everything they said you couldn't be. That was where I found myself by the middle of my second year of law school, not bitter, not desperate, but resolved in a way that scared even me sometimes, because I wasn't chasing a degree anymore. I was hunting something I couldn't even name. Something raw and buried and cold and made of every single moment I had swallowed my pride and kept moving forward when all I really wanted to do was scream. I had no illusions that the world would ever open itself up to someone like me, someone without connections or family dinners or a LinkedIn full of Uncle So-and-so, senior partner at. I had to build every inch of the staircase I was climbing with bare hands and bleeding fingers, and while others in my cohort were networking at alumni brunches or being introduced to judges by their fathers, I was spending my evenings in the back room of the courthouse, cross-referencing files for attorneys who didn't remember my name, and my weekends poring over case law so complex and obscure it felt like learning a foreign language written in disappearing ink. But I didn't care. I kept at it. I kept pushing. I kept showing up early and staying late and volunteering for the work no one else wanted, because I knew the only way I was ever going to make it to the top was by outworking everyone else in the room. Some nights, after 12 or 13 straight hours of studying, I'd walk home in the cold, hands buried in my coat pockets, face stung by the wind, and I'd pass by the courthouse building lit up from the inside, majestic and untouchable. And I'd stop and stare for a second, not because it was beautiful, but because I needed to remind myself that one day, if I did everything right, if I never slipped and never lost sight of the finish line, I'd walk through those doors and not as someone's assistant or someone's intern, but as someone who belonged there. That thought kept me warm more than any scarf ever could. By the time I graduated, I had already landed a temporary clerkship, not because I had some family friend whispering my name into the right ears, but because I had spent the last 3 years building a quiet, invisible reputation. One case file at a time, one coffee run at a time, one correctly formatted brief at a time. People started to notice. Judges started to nod when I walked past. And slowly, opportunities came, not all at once, not wrapped in a bow, but in pieces, in whispers, in offhand remarks like, "You should apply for this," or "Your name came up in chambers." And every time, I took the chance. I passed the bar on my first try, not because I was smarter than anyone else, but because I treated it like war. I didn't go out. I didn't party. I didn't let myself dream. I just studied and studied and studied until I could recite civil procedure in my sleep and outline a tort in 3 seconds flat. When I got the results, when I saw my name on that list, I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I didn't even call anyone. I just stared at the screen for a long moment, closed my laptop, and went to work. The silence around me had become a kind of armor. I didn't need applause. I didn't need recognition. I had learned how to live without them, and once you learn that, there's nothing anyone can take from you anymore. I started practicing as a junior associate in a firm known for its intensity and high turnover, and I made sure they'd never want to get rid of me. I stayed late. I volunteered for the cases no one else wanted to touch. I kept my head down and let my work do the talking, because while other people were trying to climb the ladder with charm or luck, I was carving mine into the wall with my bare hands. It was during one of those late nights, long after everyone else had gone home, the office dark except for the dim glow of my monitor, that I found myself Googling my last name. Not my new one, the one I'd taken from my mother after the final cut with my father, but the old one, Hart. I don't know why I did it. Maybe some part of me still needed to know if they even remembered I existed. Maybe I was still looking for evidence that the distance I'd created had left a mark. That's when I saw it. A local news article, small and buried behind subscription walls, but just visible enough. Hart Construction under financial investigation following allegations of fraud. It was vague talk of missing funds, irregularities in permits, whispers of shady contracting deals, but one thing stood out immediately. The names listed in the complaint were Gary Hart and Derek Hart. I didn't know how to feel at first. There was no glee, no satisfaction, not yet. Just silence. The kind that comes when you realize the story you thought was over is about to pick up again, when you feel the winds shift and know that something is coming. I read the article twice, then a third time, scanning every line, every date, every location. They had been under investigation for nearly 6 months. And I hadn't heard a word. No one had called. No one had reached out. I suppose they assumed I was gone for good, and to be fair, I had given them no reason to believe otherwise. But the universe has a way of circling back, of placing the people who burned you right in your path again, not for closure, but for confrontation. I closed my laptop, sat back in my chair, and stared out the office window at the city lights. I had spent so long climbing that I had almost forgotten what it was like to look down. But now I was high enough to see everything. And they were falling. The thought that stayed with me as I left the building that night, as I walked home under a gray sky and the hum of streetlights, was not whether I would see them again, but how. Because deep down, I knew the universe wasn't done with us yet. Not even close. It wasn't immediate, and it didn't come with any grand announcement or some cathartic cinematic swell, but rather with the steady, inevitable pull of gravity, the kind you don't notice at first, until you look up one day and realize the stars have shifted, the sky no longer where it used to be, and suddenly everything you once accepted as permanent begins to slip ever so slightly out of alignment. That was how it started, the slow unraveling of the Hart family myth, the proud legacy they had so publicly clung to like a badge of honor, finally beginning to decay beneath the glossy surface of Facebook photos and backyard barbecues. And it was during one of those long, quiet mornings in the office, sipping bitter coffee and scanning docket notices like I always did, that I first saw their names appear in the case index: Hart Construction, Gary Hart, Derek Hart, tangled together in a neat little string of legal identifiers that, at first, didn't even register as real. I remember staring at the page for a few seconds longer than necessary, blinking slowly, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering like they could feel the shift in the air too, and I couldn't help but think about how fitting it was that after all these years, after the silence and the distance and the ache I had long since stopped acknowledging, they would be dragged, kicking and screaming, I hoped, into the very world they once told me I had no business belonging to. But it wasn't excitement I felt, not then anyway. It was something colder, something quieter, a weightless sort of vindication that didn't even need to be spoken aloud. I didn't need them to suffer, I just needed them to see. The case itself was dense and layered, a perfect storm of sloppy bookkeeping, shady contractor relationships, and a long trail of unpaid subcontractors who had finally banded together after years of being pushed aside with half-promises and cash-stuffed envelopes. Derek, predictably, was at the center of it all, his name on nearly every disputed invoice, his signature scribbled across forged inspection documents, his face grinning from an outdated company website that still bragged about 3 generations of trust. Gary, on the other hand, had stayed in the background, which was his way, silent but involved, letting Derek play the role of the charismatic frontman while he moved the money around in the dark like it was still 1985 and no one would notice if a few numbers didn't quite add up. I didn't insert myself right away, because despite what people think, revenge, at least the kind that matters, isn't something you rush. It's not loud or impulsive. It's patient. It's methodical. It waits until the perfect moment, until the stage is set and the lights are low and the curtains just about to rise. So I waited. I watched the filings come in one by one, each one building a tighter noose around their reputations, and I stayed silent. No calls. No emails. Not a whisper to anyone who might connect the dots between the now-disgraced Hartman and the quiet associate moving steadily through the court's rotation system. But the moment came, as I suspected it would, and when it did, it came not with fanfare but with an email. A perfectly ordinary internal note stating that a rotating judge was being assigned to handle preliminary hearings on the Hart Construction civil suit. Simple scheduling procedures, nothing dramatic. Only, by then, I had climbed just high enough, stayed just long enough, and proven myself just quietly enough that my name was among those available for rotation in that court. So I volunteered. I signed the form without flinching. I marked my availability. I didn't request the case. I just made sure I'd be in the pool when the assignment was made. And sure enough, 2 days later, it came through. Hart vs. Vendors Group LLC, assigned to Judge R. Monroe. My name. My courtroom. My timing. I didn't laugh. I didn't smirk. I didn't even allow myself the indulgence of gloating. I simply prepared the case file like I would any other, reviewed the motions and the procedural requests, highlighted inconsistencies in Derek's testimony, of which there were many, and set the hearing date. It would be a preliminary conference, nothing that required a ruling, just a chance to establish the calendar, hear the arguments, and make sure everyone was properly represented. But I knew what it would feel like for them. Because for the first time in their lives, they would walk into a room where they weren't in control, where they couldn't talk their way out of anything, couldn't deflect or manipulate or charm the damage away, and they would have to look up, literally look up, and see the face of the person they once dismissed as irrelevant, weak, and unworthy of their money or time or pride. The night before the hearing, I slept like I hadn't in years, not because I was hungry for their humiliation, but because I had nothing left to prove. I had already won. The fact that they would see it now, on my terms and in my world, was just the final punctuation mark at the end of a sentence they'd written for me without asking. I arrived early that morning, as I always did, the courtroom still echoing with the creak of old wood and the quiet shuffle of bailiffs preparing the space. I dressed like I always did, tailored, clean lines, no distractions, because I didn't need to dress for impact. My presence was the impact. I reviewed the case file one last time, not because I needed to but because old habits die hard, and then I waited. And when I heard the door open, when I heard the voices I hadn't heard in years, the familiar bluster of my father's muttering, the hollow confidence in Derek's fake laugh, it was like everything slowed for a second. I didn't turn. I didn't acknowledge them. I simply stood, walked calmly to the bench, and took my seat. It wasn't until I looked up, until I let my eyes meet his Gary Hart, my father, standing slack-jawed in the middle of the room, his mouth half open, the color draining from his face, that I felt it. That low, steady sense of justice. Not revenge. Not spite. Just the silent realization that I had arrived. And he was a guest in my house now. There are moments in life that arrive with the subtlety of a breath held too long, moments where time neither stops nor rushes, but stretches thin and taut, as if the air itself is waiting for something to snap, and as I sat behind the elevated bench, robed in black, composed and unreadable, staring down at the two men who had once occupied the center of my universe like immovable monuments of disappointment, I knew without a flicker of doubt that this was one of those moments, carved not by luck or circumstance, but by every painful inch of the climb I had made on my own, every insult I had bitten down and swallowed, every evening I had studied until my eyes burned, every night I had gone to sleep in silence instead of calling a man who would have answered only to dismiss me again. The courtroom had taken on that quiet, humming stillness that only settles when something weighty is happening beneath the surface, when everyone in the room, even the attorney shuffling their papers and the court reporter adjusting her glasses, senses that the air has changed, that the ordinary has been replaced by something personal and quietly seismic, like a small, precise earthquake that shakes just one house on the block. My robe felt heavier that day, not because of nerves, but because of what it represented, not just the authority granted by the state, but the years of disbelief, of being told I was reaching too far, aiming too high, dreaming too wildly for a girl who, in their eyes, had always been just reliable enough to be ignored. Gary Hart did not speak when he recognized me, and in some perverse way, I respected him for that, because had he opened his mouth, had he tried to explain or apologize or shift the weight of his surprise into something performative, I think the moment would have lost its sharpness, dulled into cliché. But he didn't speak. He stood there in his cheap suit, the same shade of brown I remembered from old church services and holiday dinners, staring at me like he'd seen a ghost he hadn't even realized he'd buried, and though his lips parted as if to say something, they never quite found the words. He didn't sit until prompted, and even then, he moved like he wasn't entirely sure what was real anymore. Derek, for his part, looked confused rather than stunned, and that, too, felt familiar. My brother had always been the kind of man who coasted through life with a grin and a vague sense that someone else would clean up after him, that consequences were things that happened to other people, to people who lacked charm or connections or, as our father liked to say, raw talent. When he finally pieced it together, after the introductions, after the docket was read, after I adjusted the mic and addressed the court with the same even tone I had practiced 1,000 times, he did what he always did. He tried to smile. He leaned over to whisper something to the attorney seated beside him, probably some half-witted joke or a dismissive comment, and then he looked up at me again, as if expecting me to smile back, to offer a flicker of recognition or nostalgia or even shared amusement. But I didn't. Because I wasn't there to play a role in their old family drama. I wasn't there to validate the version of me they remembered, a girl too quiet to matter, too stubborn to praise, too competent to worry about. I was there as the judge. I was there as the authority. And if they thought this would be some kind of reckoning, some public airing of years of betrayal, then they had misunderstood me yet again. This wasn't about catharsis. This wasn't about revenge. This was about power. Quiet, restrained, absolute. The hearing was procedural. There were no dramatic rulings, no pounding gavels, no outbursts. I conducted it like any other case, fairly, efficiently, without commentary. I listened. I took notes. I addressed each counsel with equal attention. I corrected a timeline error. I denied a frivolous motion. I outlined the calendar moving forward with clear expectations for evidence submission and witness lists. I did everything a judge is supposed to do. And yet, every single word, every measured pause, every flick of the pen, felt like a statement they couldn't refute, because the mere fact that I was there, in that robe, on that bench, doing my job with precision and calm, was louder than any accusation could ever be. When the hearing concluded, and the attorneys began to shuffle their papers, exchanging polite nods and murmured goodbyes, I watched my father stand slowly, his knees stiffer than I remembered, his hands shaking just enough to betray the control he so desperately wanted to maintain. He didn't look at me this time. Not directly. He stared at the floor as if the carpet might hold the answers he couldn't find in my eyes. Derek lingered. He had the audacity to approach the bench once the room had mostly cleared, his posture relaxed, his voice low, carrying that same tone he used to use when asking to borrow my car without asking directly, casual entitlement wrapped in feigned charm. Rachel. I mean, Judge Monroe, he said, testing the name, trying it on like a jacket he didn't understand the price of. You really made it, huh? I looked at him for the first time since the hearing began. Really looked at him, not just the expensive haircut or the watch that probably came from the last unsecured loan, not just the suit tailored to impress investors rather than juries, but the man himself. And what I saw wasn't anger or resentment or even guilt. It was emptiness. He had spent so long skating across the surface of things that he had no idea how deep water really felt. I told you, I said, voice even, eyes steady, I was worth the investment. He smirked, trying to mask whatever flicker of discomfort was surfacing, but it didn't hold. He mumbled something, maybe good for you, or maybe just damn, and walked out without another word. Gary followed, never once turning around. I didn't move until the doors closed. I didn't sigh. I didn't shake. I simply gathered my notes, filed the papers in the proper tray, and left the bench exactly as I'd found it. That evening, I drove home through the city, the windows down, the weight of the day sitting on my shoulders like a mantle I had earned. When I got inside, I kicked off my shoes, poured a glass of water, and opened my laptop out of habit. I didn't expect to check anything. I just needed the quiet glow of the screen to bring me down from the altitude I'd spent all day flying in. But when I logged into the old Facebook account I hadn't touched in years, just to look, just to see, I noticed something. Derek's boat, the gleaming pride of our father's misplaced generosity, was listed for sale. No photos. Just the words, inquire privately. Serious offers only. I stared at that listing for a long time, and then, almost without thinking, I typed a message into the contact form, no name, no signature, just one sentence. Does it float as well as your ego used to? I didn't send it. Of course not. I wasn't that person anymore. Instead, I closed the tab, turned off the lights, and stood in the dark for a while, listening to the silence not as a void, but as a presence. Because that's what power really feels like, not noise, not applause, but the absence of need. And the knowledge that when they finally saw me, really saw me, it was already too late.